Okay. Okay, so as Vaz said, and thanks for the introduction, Vaz, I direct the Dawes Centre for Future Crime at UCL. I also co-direct a Centre for Doctoral Training at UCL in cybersecurity, which bears some relevance for what we'll talk about today. But I'm going to really focus on the Dawes Centre for Future Crime. I'll talk about the agenda. I'll talk about the kind of work that we do and some of the funding that's available, and then we'll hand over later to some of the researchers at UCL that we've collaborated with in the past, just to give you a sense of what some of those projects look like and how the collaborations or the funding has worked out. So, just for context, it's worth saying that if we look at rates of crime over time, and these are data from the crime survey of England and Wales, so these are crimes for the United Kingdom, you can see that over time we saw an increase in crime in the 1980s, which peaked around the mid-1990s, and thereafter we've seen a sort of gradual decline in what we might describe as kind of urban crimes. But it's only recently that we've been able to capture details or levels of victimisation for crimes committed online, such as fraud and computer misuse. And when we do that using data from the crime survey of England and Wales, we see that actually levels of crime are effectively double when we count these sorts of offences. And it's important to recognise that from the crime survey of England and Wales, it doesn't capture all sorts of offences which are committed online. So this is likely to be an underestimate of all offences committed in online environments. So the point of sort of showing you this slide is for a general context about how crime has changed over time and the fact that actually the nature of crime is changing somewhat. Okay. Now, as well as crime changing kind of on a kind of longer timescales, we've seen in the context of the global pandemic, we've seen quite big shifts in crime patterns or disruptions to the crime opportunity structure. And the figures that you see in front of you illustrate crimes that are committed, sort of traditional crimes committed in urban environments, which are the figures on the right-hand side, and then crimes committed or a selection of crime committed online in the graph on the left-hand side. So we can see that for crimes such as burglary, the orange line there is the actual observed rate of offences per month for the period shown, and the dotted line and the grey confidence interval show you what levels of crime would be expected during that period. And we can see that for during this period, levels of burglary and theft from the person, these sort of traditional urban crimes, are much lower than we would have expected given the preceding trends across the country. When we shift to the graph on the left, these are data from Action Fraud, to whom the public report online offending. We see that online shopping fraud, as an example, we see that increase quite substantially during the lockdown period. So we can see disruptions like a pandemic can impact on crime opportunity and consequently the sort of crimes that we see taking place. And this illustrates that rates of crime can shift very quickly in response to externalities or external events. Now we know that as well as certain things changing over time on fast and slow timescales, one of the things we also know is that when new technologies are developed or new products and services are introduced, it's often the case that little attention is given to the crime and security implications of those services, technologies and products by the people that manufacture them. And that leads to vulnerabilities being present in those products or services. Unfortunately, even though the manufacturers might not think about those sorts of issues, criminals tend to do so, and we see them exploiting those vulnerabilities, and we see sometimes what we see taking place is what we refer to as a crime harvest. I thought I'd illustrate this with the first example of a crime harvest. This is the penny black postage stamp. It's the world's first prepaid postage stamp, introduced in 1840. The idea was that you use the stamp in the usual way. Once it had been used, a red franking was applied to the stamp, which would render it has been indicated that it's actually been used and that it couldn't be used in the future. The problem was that at the time, red ink was water soluble, which meant that people could simply just wash that franking off and reuse the stamp. At the time, the only ink that wasn't water soluble was black ink. So the solution they came up with at the time was to reverse the colours. So the stamp became red and the franking became black. And that way, if you tried to wash the franking off, you essentially destroyed the stamp. But it's quite incredible if you think about it that, given that there are only 2 permutations, they actually got this wrong in the first instance, which indicates that, a lack of real depth of thinking in terms of the crime and security implications of this particular commodity or service. And we've seen this repeated throughout history. We've seen this problem with the design of vehicles, with vehicle crime being at its peak in the 1990s. That was addressed through better security, but we've seen a resurgence of vehicle crime in more recent years as manufacturers have started to use remote access technologies which have vulnerabilities built into them. But we've also seen crimes such as exploitation of the Internet of Things and so on. But the changes that can impact upon crime aren't just technological. And if you think about some of the changes which are taking place at the moment, we're seeing quite significant shifts in kind of social trends, economic trends, environmental trends and others. And at the centre, we're really interested in understanding how technological shift, environmental changes, social changes and so on all can impact on crime and criminal opportunities. So the centre was essentially set up to think more systematically about how technological, social or environmental change might generate crime harvests and what we might do to address these. It was set up with funding from the Dawes Trust. We were given £3.7 million of funding, and we had some match funding from UCL to help us with this particular endeavour. And what we've been doing with this money is conducting a series of projects in the centre, but also commissioning research across UCL and across some other universities to look at particular technologies or social or environmental changes. So in each case, we conduct a piece of work on a particular technology or a convergence of technologies, as you'll hear, or convergence of factors, as you'll hear one of the examples later focuses on ageing and online banking. So in each case, we look at this particular issue, and the research often involves a kind of desk-based exercise to understand the state of the art of the literature, but also importantly, we interact with stakeholders, and they can include other academics, law enforcement, government departments, the voluntary sector, and so on. And we work with those stakeholders to ensure the impact of our work, but also to ensure that we understand the problems as clearly as possible, to allow us to get access to relevant data that we might need to understand the problems, and to ensure that any solutions that we might come up with to address the sorts of problems that we're studying are sensitive to the constraints within which different stakeholders are working. So we conduct research, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the research projects and the structure of those in a second. These are distinct research projects, but we also fund PhD students to work on these and other related topics. So the slide in front of you now gives you a sense of some of the topics that we've been looking at today. And you can see I've differentiated here between what we call scoping projects. So these are shorter projects that last between sort of 3 to 6 months in duration. And they involve a desk-based review on a particular topic. Then we usually have a sandpit activity where we'd invite stakeholders to engage with us for a period of a couple of days usually to discuss a particular issue, better understand it, and to prioritise what we might do about that issue going forwards. And the ones that I've highlighted here are ones where we have researchers with us today who might talk about these particular topics. We then have slightly longer projects, which are shown in light blue on the slide, and these last in duration from 6 to 12 or to 24 months. These are often co-funded by other agencies. So for some of these projects, such as the COVID-19 project, that's completely funded by UKRI. In other cases, such as the work on the IoT and crime, that was part funded by the EPSRC. And wherever possible, where we're conducting these longer projects, we do try to co-fund those projects so that we can make the resources that we have stretch further. You can also see on the slide in front of you, those boxes shaded in grey are the PhD projects. I haven't listed all of those here, but as you might have seen from the previous slide, we have funding for around about 22 PhD projects on topics that are relevant to the centre. And some of those are listed, and again, you'll see that some of those are highlighted. And again, we have the PhD students or supervisors involved in those projects with us today, and they may talk about those projects in a few minutes. In terms of the funding that we have available, I've already given you a kind of sense of what those are. So the phase 1 projects, as I said, are these kind of scoping projects where we work very closely with stakeholders, and what we're trying to do here is better understand the issues and to come up with achievable solutions to address particular issues. We have funding, as I said, for slightly longer projects, research projects that might be 6 to 12 or slightly longer duration. But we also have funding for what we call impact research fellows. So this would be where if a project has been conducted and we better understand an issue, but we need a little bit more work done to actually achieve a realisable real-world impact, we have some funding available for that very specific purpose of translating the research into real-world impact. We have some funding available for international exchange, and again, the idea here would be to support a variety of these different projects by bringing somebody into the UK who has particular expertise on a topic. We have the secret PhD students. I've already mentioned that, and we can take questions on that at the end if people want specific details. And we've more recently launched a small grant scheme. And the idea here is to provide funding for small projects for either early career researchers or PhD students to do small pieces of work which directly align with the aims of the centre. And we have up to £10,000 available for those grants for early career postdoctoral researchers and £5,000 available for PhD students who want to do pieces of work which are relevant to the centre. And Mariam, who's here with us today, might discuss the work that she's been doing with one of those small grants. In terms of the way this all works, if you're interested in working with us, what we tend to do with researchers is to talk to them about their proposals or the sort of proposed project they want to do in the first instance and try to help hone that particular project. We then have a short application form which will invite people to submit if they've got a topic that we think will be relevant to the centre. Those are then reviewed by the Dawes Centre's Executive Committee, which includes staff at UCL, but also external stakeholders. And we would invite people to write proposals both for the phase 1 projects, the small grants, and the phase 2 proposals. And by phase 2 proposals here, I mean those slightly longer research projects, which might be conducted as a consequence of initially conducting a phase 1 project, or in some cases we might fund a phase 2 proposal from the outset. And we have done that in a number of cases. Usually when we fund a phase 2 project without having done a phase 1 project, those the researchers involved bring co-funding with them, and that's what's happened in a number of our projects to date. And the idea here is to use the resources of the centre as kind of as pump priming, essentially to deliver projects of a larger scale. If you're interested in the submitting a proposal and you want to see the forms that we use for this purpose, or you just want to have a general chat, please do reach out to Vaz, whose contact details are on the slide in front of you. And as is hinted at in this slide, where we're looking at these sort of phase 2 projects, it is our hope that in some cases we'll be able to bring in external funding such as that from the research councils, Home Office, College of Policing, British Academy, other sources, again to increase the sort of scale of the research that we can do. And the research that the funding that the centre can offer is intended in these cases to provide a kind of competitive advantage for researchers applying for these larger scale resources. Okay, the last slide from me is just to say that with all the work that we've been doing, we tend to produce policy briefings for policymakers, law enforcement, industry and others who might want to engage with us but simply don't have the time to read long academic articles. So the policy briefings are usually 3, maybe 5 pages in length, and they're written for the specific audience that we have in mind, and there are some examples of them on the slide in front of you, and each of those are freely downloadable from our website, and we also distribute, we sort of target their distribution to those stakeholders who we think can make a difference and who would be interested in this particular research. We're also doing a special issue of the journal Crime Science. You see the example on the right hand side of the slide. This is a paper by Lewis, who's with us today. I don't know if you can see from the image in front of you, but his paper was on AI-enabled future crime. And you can see, hopefully from that, you can see the number of accesses for that paper is 16,000. And this is for a paper that was only published in August last year. So the journal, because it's fully open access, gets it has a high readership. It has the highest download rate of all Springer's crime and criminal justice journals on the internet. So it's a well-read journal. I think that's all I want to say in terms of dissemination. Finally, if you're interested in PhDs, we have details on our website. We also recently did a PhD open evening, the details of which are on the YouTube URL at the bottom. So if you want to know more about that, please do access that site. And that's me for now. Thank you.
A couple of other minor points. So the home department of the Dawes Centre for Future Crime is the Security and Crime Science department here at UCL. But what we've tried to do over the last few years is to use our funding to create collaborations with researchers from across UCL. And so we've selected some of the speakers today to represent that diversity in the way that we've been seeking other people to work with. So we're going to start with Professor Claudia Cooper. It's not Kua, in spite of what it says next to her name. And Professor Cooper is the Professor of Psychiatry of Older Age at the Division of Psychiatry in UCL's Faculty of Brain Sciences. And she's been doing a really topical piece of work with a colleague from our own Department of Security and Crime Science, Dr. Kartikeya Tripathi, and I will leave her to tell you about it.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can see my slide, on current slide. There we go. Well, thank you for inviting me today. I've certainly had a very happy collaboration with your department over the last few years. This project and the work that we did before it is very much a cross-faculty UCL collaboration. I'm from the Division of Psychiatry and working closely with Kartikeya from your department. We started thinking about this because I have an interest in elder abuse and the impact that has on older people. And Kartikeya first got in touch with me and we applied for some UCL Grand Challenge money to explore cybercrime in Mumbai. And this was at the time particularly topical. There's a lot of concern about the lack of regulation in this very rapidly growing economy, of the impact of older people often being left without their adult children who were moving to Western countries, and a lot of shame around reporting. And that was quite a toxic mix in terms of leaving older people in Mumbai, very much at risk of elder abuse. So that set us thinking about what it's like in England in terms of risks of cybercrime to older people. And thus we put together this project, which is Dawes Centre funded, to do a realist review. And realist review methodology really fitted our research question because we wanted to scope and look very broadly at this to understand what's out there already, to help us understand how older people become cybercrime victims so that we could move on and use it to inform a larger study. And it's certainly been a very successful review in looking at where the gaps are in the evidence. We found 24 research studies, and some of what we found was expected, but there's also been some interesting areas. Of course, you can see from the timing of this project that this actually became even more topical through COVID, because what I've experienced in my other work is that there's been a massive shift of older people online, and that's a fantastic opportunity. It's reduced a lot of isolation, it's increased accessibility of services, but it also risks increasing inequalities, and it risks exposing people to cybercrime. Now, the key thing that we've been thinking about is that it's not okay to say people are at risk of cybercrime because they are older per se. That would be sort of inherently ageist. But there is something about the older group that puts them at increased risk. So what can we understand about that? What's very striking, I think gap number one, is that there's very little epidemiological evidence. Now, it seems fairly logical that cybercrime risk in older people is going up because so many more older people are using the internet and they have a number of vulnerability risks. But there's only one Australian big data study out there. So our first potential gap that we'd like to fill in future work is to mine the enormous amount of big data that is out there to really understand this more, to understand how common cybercrime is in this population and who is most at risk so that we can do something about it. Most of the evidence is from fairly small qualitative studies, but there is a synthesis emerging that it's when you have cognitive impairments, higher levels of confusion, isolation, and computer inexperience, those are the populations that tend to be at increased risk. And there's something very important about the role of the people around you in protecting you or not protecting you. And as you begin to lose your independence, if you develop frailties in older age, really the relationships that you have in those networks are what tend to determine how much at risk you are. And there's still very much a culture of victim blaming, which reduces reporting. Now, the biggest gap that we found, which we are very interested to fill, is the complete lack of evidence on what you actually do about this. We found only 3 fairly small, fairly low quality studies, actually. Only one of them was controlled, which looked at what you do about cybercrime in older people. There's one looking at some training people to look after peers, or the only trial compared giving people some text advice and some video advice to see what increased awareness. So in terms of technological solutions, more sophisticated solutions that could be rolled out, public health interventions, it's wide open. So because this was a realist review, we did this evidence synthesis, and then we had a sandpit, and we invited, with the help of the Dawes Centre, and that's one of the great things about this collaboration, was we had all manner of experts thinking about this matter one morning, and we had various useful breakout groups and so forth. And they agreed with what we'd found to date, but added some extra things about the risks of mental illness and who is watching the guardians. Again, coming back to this key carer role, which can be protective, but it can also be a risk. And there were some some of the experts from Australia, I remember, were thinking about, well, don't just think about the victim, how could you work with the offender? So this is just being written up now, and we're targeting to get this in Aging Research Reviews, which is a high impact journal, by May. And we are interviewing this week for a PhD fellowship, and we hope to work together and continue this work in the form of a Dawes funded PhD fellowship. And obviously the student would be working up the protocol for that, but there are many interesting studies to be done around mining big data to look at risk, around methodology, perhaps looking in detail about how risk occurs, and about developing an intervention. As there's a plane going over, that seems like a good place to stop. Thank you.
Next, we are moving on swiftly to Professor Lewis Griffin, who is a professor of computational vision in UCL's computer science department. And Lewis has made a big splash last year with a piece of work that he did with us. Lewis, please take it away.
Hi, let me work out my screen sharing. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to speak very briefly about this piece of work that I did with the support, really good support, really good encouragement from the Dawes Centre, and it was done by a research group I have, Compass Computational Security Science, and it was on the topic of AI-enabled future crime, and it's already been mentioned, it got published at the end of last year in Crime Science. So the culmination of this project was a workshop that we ran at Missenden Abbey, and we discussed possible crimes AI-enabled crimes under 4 headings, which you can see there in blue, which are preliminary analysis had kind of broken the problem space down into patterns and predictions, fake content, and so on. You can read those there. And to this workshop, we invited participants from academia, from the public sector and from the private sector, some from UK and some from abroad, but lots of interesting people all together for a couple of days. It was great fun. And as well as the main thing we did was a ranking exercise, or about half the time, so it was on a ranking exercise. But we also did a lot of briefing the participants about AI, what AI could do and what it was likely to be able to do in the near future. And this was an important part of the project, not only to inform the ranking process, but there were a lot of people out there, a lot of interested people out there who wanted to know more about AI and how it might be used in crime. So we did a lot of this briefing, and that was a lot of fun. This is just one slide from this briefing that was trying to convey the trajectory, by extrapolation, the trajectory of AI in the near future. And then, so the other thing we did apart from briefing was to get it to think about how worrying various crimes were, and to think about that along 4 dimensions that we identified from our preliminary analysis: harm, profit, achievability, and defeatability. And they did this ranking in small groups using these grids called Q sorting grids. And what you do is you have all your crimes for a particular dimension on your post-it notes, and you kind of move them around a bell curve to say which is better and which is worse. It's very, it's kind of takes the stress out of the thing, having this bell curve superimposed, and that worked very well. So we did all of that on different dimensions. And then this is the final output, slightly complicated figure. This is all the 30 odd crimes, or a bit less, 20 crimes that we, after we'd kind of merged them, that we worked on. And this is them arranged from low threat on the left to high threat on the right. So let me just zoom in on the higher threat ones. So there were 6 that came out as cause for concern. The highest cause for concern was audio video impersonation, what people are calling deep fakes. And you can see there these 4 colored bars. They show how it was assessed on the 4 dimensions: harm, profit, and so on. And if the bars are above the line, it means it's good for the criminal. If they're below the line, it's poor for the criminal. So deep fakes came out top because they're worrying in all aspects. Whereas, say, they're over there on the left, AI authored fake news was less, still worrying. It's still in our high slice, but less worrying, probably because it didn't come out as profitable, because it wasn't clear how you made a buck from it. So that pushed its concern down. And similarly, say, driverless vehicles as weapons was less concerning than one might think, because the participants of the workshop decided that it was relatively defeatable. The same hard barriers that have been used for vehicles being driven by people would apply for driverless vehicles as weapons. So it was relatively defeatable. So that was what came out of that, and we wrote this up in this paper and wrote pieces on each of the individual crimes and so on. So I'm going to stick to my 3 minutes to try and wrap up. It was great fun. That's the main thing, isn't it? We had a great time, and the Dawes were really supportive, and they pushed us as well. But it was all right to be pushed, because they gave us a lot of support, of contacts and organisational stuff. And we didn't just take their money. I think we really, because of that support, we really did a better piece of work than if we'd been sort of left to our own devices. And the other good thing about it was, of course, it led to not just a well-viewed publication in crime science, but my first and probably only front page of the Daily Star, where they picked up on burglar bots. And of course, it's a misleading front page, because actually we said burglar bots, really, we don't need to worry about burglar bots. but it made a good front page for them and made me smile to see it. That's me done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lewis. And you're not the only one who smiled. And the level of coverage for that particular project, it wasn't just a Daily Star. There was coverage all around the world. And, I've got some brilliant shots of papers as far afield as Australia featuring that particular project. Okay, so we're going to move on to Samaya Ali. Now, Samaya is a doctoral student within our department, within the Security Science Doctoral Training Centre, which is also known as UCL Secret. She's much more than that, of course. She's also a cybersecurity expert whose articles and blogs are read all across the Middle East. Samaya, would you like to tell us a little bit about your work with us?
Thank you, Vas. Good afternoon, everyone. So my project, my PhD work is titled as Online Grooming Opportunities, and my work is focused on a popular online social network, one of the social media platforms. I'm going to refer to it as OSNX. So basically, the idea behind my work is that the increase of usage of social media platforms among teenagers and the increase of the usage among the whole population of in the world has brought the number of reported online grooming cases to a really high level recently. And the problem in the academic field is that the literature is seldom focusing on online grooming itself. And if there is any work done, it is outdated, or it just focuses on the offender or the victim or the psychological aspect of the offense. And very rarely you'll find work that really focuses on the offense of the online grooming as a whole, meaning that looking at the offender, the victim, and the guardianship, like the surveillance. What are we doing to protect the victims? That is why I have designed my PhD work to focus on all these three items, elements. And the basis of my work starts with auditing the accounts of real children on OSNX, just to have an understanding what a typical child's account looks like, understand their vulnerabilities and how they present themselves online. And then the second part is exploring the opportunities of online grooming that are there or enabled by the technology that the social media platforms are offering, and specific the OSNX, that's the focus of my study. So I have created 4 fictitious accounts of girls using the information I gathered from the first part of my PhD, and I have put the fake accounts online and studied the algorithms of the platform. And I looked at the kind of probable offenders, I wouldn't call them probable offenders, but suspicious contacts that communicates with the fake accounts, just to understand what kind of exposure children have to these online and cyber communities. And I have focused here as well on the presence of guardian on the child's profile on OSNX, and whether using a personal photo makes a difference. Does it make them more vulnerable or not? And then the last part of my PhD, which is currently what I'm working on, I have started interviewing investigating officers from all across the UK, just to validate and kind of find the connections between what I have found so far from my other 2 parts of my experiments, and to discuss and present maybe more of prevention approach towards online grooming or reducing the number of reported online grooming offenses in the UK. So that is the 3 parts of my PhD in summary. My goal is, and I hope that I contribute to the prevention of online grooming on OSNs as much as possible, and to help social media providers provide a more secured environment for children once they're online and spending time on their platforms, and to help with certain elements of the outcome of my work, the law enforcement and the education sector. Before I wrap up, I just wanted to thank Dawes Centre for Future Crime for making this study possible. They are not just financially generous, but I find Dawes Centre a very healthy environment that always welcomes discussion of ideas and encourages us on a lot of levels. It's a very creative team, and I really appreciate that. And on top of that, the exposure to the industry is really high, and they always and constantly support us and help us to reach out and make our work really applicable and have a high impact. So that was it from my side, my PhD of 4 years in 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Samaya. And I promise everyone watching that we have not coached these speakers to say such nice things about the Dawes Centre. So moving on, we're next going to hear from Professor Ben Bradford, who is a professor of global city policing at the Department of Security and Crime Science. He's also the director of the Institute for Global City Policing, which is an initiative that has been jointly funded by UCL, the Metropolitan Police, and the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. And Ben's work has been primarily around policing, public trust, police legitimacy, which of course, if any of you have been following the trial of Derek Chauvin in America, you'll realize is a very, very hot topic at this moment in time. Ben, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Vaz, and thanks for the invite. I haven't got any slides, unlike everyone else, so you just have to listen to me talking. And what I wanted to talk about in my allotted 3 minutes is what I think is an emerging joint programme of work, really, between the Dawes Centre and the Institute for Global City Policing, which, broadly speaking, concerns the way that emerging technologies are used in security provision, and particularly policing, and especially in relation to questions of public acceptability, trust, legitimacy, the kinds of things that Vaz was just mentioning there. Just to give 2 examples. First, we have my PhD student, Julian Lauf's PhD research, which is funded by the Dawes Centre, which covers both the general issue of the use of technology in security provision and actually the question of social acceptability in particular. He's not here, so speaking for him, what Julian's done is 2 things primarily. He's conducted a systematic review that explores recent literature concerned with new smart city security technologies. It's focusing on smart city tech, and which investigates the extent to which these new interventions correspond with traditional security provision. He's also just completed a large online experimental study which considers how people think about smart city security interventions. So he's manipulated the intrusiveness of the intervention, the level of automation, the effectiveness and location, with a particular emphasis on whether people distinguish between human and artificial intelligence decision makers. He's still working on writing that up. And secondly, we've got a number of studies, kind of in the sense, a wider body of research we've been conducting within the IGCP, which speaks directly to these same kinds of issues. So, for example, we've worked with the London Policing Ethics Panel on public judgments about police use of live facial recognition technology in London primarily, so they're used by the Met. And what we found in this project is the extent to which people trust police is as a key driver of the judgments they make about the acceptability of this kind of technology. So people already low in trust react very negatively towards it, driving a further wedge between police and community, again, in exactly the kind of way I think that Vaz was just mentioning. We also found evidence of a chilling effects, so a reluctance to use public spaces where facial recognition technology is in use. And this is again connected to low levels of trust and concentrated particularly in minority communities of various types. We also have another study which is rising up, which is similar to Julian's actually, which considers the distinctions people draw between policing decisions, for example, relating to hotspots, crime hotspots, that are made by police officers versus those that are directed by artificial intelligence in some way. And we find very clearly that people are more trusting of policing decisions made by human actors. So I think the big issue here for me is, as we've been hearing, not only does the social and technological change create new opportunities for crime that require adaptations in policing, the same changes also create new opportunities to enhance policing responses. And I don't need to tell anyone on this call that the rate and the extent of change in this area is only going to increase in the years and decades to come. But care needs to be taken, I think, to ensure that legitimacy, trust, public trust is not sacrificed for efficiency, let's say. And perhaps more saliently, I think that police need to avoid contributing to deep-seated social problems that drive inequities in the delivery, and particularly the experience of security, that leave some people feeling over-policed and underprotected in exactly the same way that we were tapping into with the live facial recognition work, I think. I think there are profound ethical, political, and practical concerns here. We've already been touched on some of them, of course, in the presentations we've been hearing, which in the coming years, police organisations, security providers of all types, right across the world, will need to address. And it seems to me this is exactly the type of area in which both our centres, so the Dawes Centre and the Institute for Global City Policing, should be conducting research. And I certainly will be very keen, and I hope Shane is too, to push some of these ideas forward in the future. So thanks again for the invitation, and I'll hand back to you, Vaz.
Thank you, Ben. Okay, so on we go. And next up is Mariam Elgabri, and Mariam is another doctoral student here at UCL, funded by the Dawes Centre, and she will be telling you about her work on synthetic biology. She also is an entrepreneur. She is the co-founder of a engineering spin-out company called Enteromics, and no doubt she'll tell you a little bit about that too. Over to you, Mariam.
Right, so I'm a PhD researcher between the Dawes Centre and the Advanced Centre for Biochemical Engineering. I research biocrime, the Internet of Medical Things, and cyber biosecurity. And as Vas said, alongside my research, I'm a co-founder and director of a medtech startup. My background is in deep tech and bioengineering, and I have experience leading award-winning projects during my time at AstraZeneca and Microsoft. And I'm on a mission to build secure, smart pills for smart health. Now, what if I told you that your DNA is only 0.1% unique to you, and that actually the ecosystem of microbes in your gut microbiome, is more than 90% unique to you? So what does that mean about your microbial signature? How does that affect biocrime? Well, you might not know, but you are more bacteria than you are you. And unlike DNA that can reveal your genetic makeup, your gut microbiome reveals a lot more than that. So it reveals things about your lifestyle, who you live with, if you live in the city, if you have a pet. And believe it or not, it also reveals social behavior, as your gut is connected to your brain. So it's no wonder why there's this interest in accessing the gut through emerging internet-connected digital pills. These swallowable smart pills contain sensors and have a relatively long history. And as you can see here, as an example, NASA has been using these to help track their athletes' core temperature for almost 15 years. Now, the problem is with emerging technology, and as a lot of people have said so far, comes emerging crime opportunities. Health data is being sold in the black market for up to 20 times more than any other types of data, such as your credit card credentials. And unlike your credit card credentials, health data can't be regenerated, right? You can't regenerate your DNA. So what does that really mean for the security of valuable biological material? Yes, I mean you. This is my research. I aim to underpin evidence-based policymaking regarding biocrime, and where relevant, to change organizational culture and practices to improve national security. I've conducted a systematic review, which has been published in the International Journal of Frontiers, edited and reviewed by members of the CDC, US National University of Defense, and Department of Health Services, and has reached over 3,000 experts worldwide. The systematic review revealed the criminogenic potential of biotech, or synthetic biology. And I've also elicited the opinion of field experts with both traditional backgrounds, such as government officials, but also non-traditional experts, such as biohackers, to extract different views on what these crime opportunities might look like. And both have strongly agreed that biocrime will take place in this intersection of the cyber and bio domains. But there are no current frameworks in place to really address these. So taken together, we have these three key recommendations. Number one, create cyber biosecurity policy and standards to really strengthen our preparedness. Number two is to adopt an experimental approach through ethical hacking as a harm reduction tactic. And number three is to really increase biotechnology and biosecurity literacy. And so to demonstrate these, I am leading the very first Internet of Ingestible Things workshop, which is supported by the Dawes Centre for Future Crime, that really brings cyber security experts and medical device regulatory bodies and the actual industry to think about cyber biosecurity at the design stage of medical devices and to inform policy by delivering a set of principles. Because fundamentally, security is an innovation driver and a business enabler. So far, with the support of Dawes, outcomes of my research include knowledge transfer activities with really specialized groups such as the biometrics unit of the Metropolitan Police of London, as well as presenting to over 200 attendees at the UK Home Office. My work has been recognized and published at the UK Parliament Joint Committee on National Security, has been featured in special COVID-19 policing papers by both the Jill Dando Institute and Policing Insights. And as Vaz mentioned earlier, I've managed to turn parts of my PhD research into a medtech startup, which is ranked in the top 5 out of more than 500 applicants of last year's Mayor's Entrepreneur Health Award, hosted by Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London. We've also been recently awarded an Innovate UK Smart Grant Award, which if you're in the academic world, you realize how competitive those are. And I've recently been quite humbled to be shortlisted as a Greek International Woman of the Year under the Science and Technology Award. But I'll leave you with one last message, which is that in an increasingly health-centered global economy, it is time for digital biosecurity. So if you too are interested in prioritizing responsible health tech and bringing a more bio-savvy public, then please do get in touch. Thank you for listening and thank you for having me today.
Thanks a lot, Mariam, for that very intriguing presentation. So last, but definitely by no means least, is Dr. Rob Moss, who is a lecturer in applied radiation physics at the Department of Medical Physics and Biomedical Engineering. And Rob, as well as being a wonderful researcher, has also embarked upon his TV career this over the course of the Dawes project, as I'm sure he will tell you about in a few minutes.
Thanks very much, Vaz, for that introduction. Yeah, I'm going to tell you about this project, which is the development of an on-site detection system for illegal agrochemical detection. And whilst I'm giving this presentation, I've got to give credit to my colleagues, Professor Robert Speller and Dr. J.C. Kong, who have done the majority of the work on this project. Let's just see if I can get this one. Here we go. So illegal agrochemicals fall into one of 4 categories, really. There's genuine counterfeits, if that's not an oxymoron. So these are things that are not what they pretend to be. There's substandard, so these may be legitimate chemicals that have somehow been adulterated to reduce their effectiveness. And then there's banned and unauthorized agrochemicals, which may be allowed to be used in other parts of the world, but are not permitted to be used in the UK or Europe, for example. Trade in illegal agrochemicals accounts for about 1.3 billion euros every year, and that number is growing. It's an ever-increasing criminal activity. And of course, these chemicals are completely unregulated. So if they're used at the farm level, then there's a possibility that there's a danger to human and animal health, also temporary or permanent damage to crops and farmland, and potentially damage to kind of the environment at large. So what do we want to do about this? Well, at the moment, seizure of illegal agrochemicals is really based on prior intelligence or identifying discrepancies in paperwork. But there is no way of definitively identifying an illegal chemical at the point of entry to the UK, for example. So what we want to do is to develop a screening tool, so something that can be deployed and used very rapidly, but gives a go, no-go type of decision. And we think that a tool like this would be really useful to border agency staff, you know, customs officials at the point of entry to a country, used by regulators that go around and check that farms are using chemicals responsibly, and possibly used by chemical wholesalers in the UK and in European countries and the world over. So the approach that we've taken is firstly to identify technologies that can tell the difference between different chemicals, so essentially give us some kind of fingerprint. Ideally, we want to concentrate on technologies that are able to work through the container. If we can prevent people using this tool from opening a container, then that obviously safeguards them against contact with a potentially dangerous chemical, and also increases the speed at which they can do this screening task. And we also wanted to look at technologies that have got the potential to be miniaturized or made compact or be operated in a simple way. And of course, that leads you down a path. Okay, so what technologies are we going to look at? Well, we've looked at the ones that are typically used for chemical analysis. So things like FTIR and Raman spectroscopy. And we've also looked at technologies that have been developed for other applications. And a good example is medical ultrasound. And that leads me on very nicely to this, which is a pretty good result that I'd like to share with you. So this is some ultrasound measurements. On this side here, we have ultrasound transducer, exactly the type that is used for imaging patients in hospital. And then we have here a water bath, and inside the water bath we have a cylindrical container that has our liquid pesticide, our agrochemical. And what you get is an image over here that looks very similar to the sort of ultrasound that some of you may be familiar with. But you can identify the front and the back wall of the bottle, and that means that we can then measure the distance between the front and the back wall. And this distance is derived based on the speed of sound of the sound waves in the pesticide. And what we find is that we created a test set where we have various different chemicals, and we have them at their 100% purity. And then we've also adulterated them with water to different levels. So this is 25% water, 75% pesticide, and here is a 50-50 mix. And what you can see, this plot shows you effectively the diameter of the container. And you see a change in the diameter of the container with when you add some kind of adulterant. And really, it's not a real change in the diameter. It's a change in the properties of the material inside the container. And so we can use this as a way of telling whether a chemical is out of place, shall we say. Excuse me. So that's a really interesting result, and we're keen to continue this work. I would like to say a little bit about the Dawes Centre and where they fit in. So as well as having funded all of the work that we've done so far, they've been really helpful in facilitating the original sandpit event that we had in phase 1, making sure that happened smoothly and making sure that we got a sensible outcome. And it was that event that really gave us hooks into identifying illegal agrochemicals as a big problem worldwide. They've also helped in terms of giving the project exposure. So the policy briefing that Shane mentioned is one thing, and then we also appeared on BBC Countryfile, and here's a picture of me and JC recording that piece for the BBC. And they've also helped us develop links with stakeholders. So these are chemical manufacturers, stakeholders in government and regulatory organisations that are interested in the work that we're doing and are supporting our work. So we're really grateful to the Dawes Centre for that. I'll finish there because I'm out of time, but happy to take questions. Thanks, Vaz.
Thanks a lot, Rob. So that brings us to the end of our scheduled presentation.